this is funded by a generous grant from the John Templeton Foundation. And I'll just remind you, I'm looking around recognizing how many of you have been to lots of our events, and I'm thankful to see you again. But this is, our goals are to foster civic identity, commitment, and civic mindedness through community engaged learning. Towards that end, the Speaker Series provides a forum for us to host individuals who have distinguished themselves through their service within the community and through their ability to advance our understanding of the civil rights movement or the development of civic virtues. Even in the stories I was hearing from Dr. Robinson, he's one of our community exemplars who is helping us learn about and understand the history of the civil rights movement. Today's event is the fourth speaker of our academic year and the first of spring semester. We hope you can join us for our upcoming events. On March the 5th, we have the poet, Dr. Jacqueline Trimble. Her, I think, most recent book is called Surviving the Apocalypse. She'll do some poetry readings and discuss her work. On April 10th, we have author and illustrator of a graphic novel called Black and White, and it's a memoir. Her name is Lila Quintero Weaver. I'll just remind you that HHMI and CRCV co-sponsor an out-of-the-box workshop, which you've gotten emails about from me probably recently, and that'll be May 14th and 15th. And then right now the application information is out for the summer seminar, which will be June 23rd and 27th. As you all probably know, Aaron Cobb was a director of this grant, and in part because of the work he's done with CRCV, he was hired to be a senior scholar for the Wake Forest Educating Character Initiative. We will miss him, but I'm very proud of him and look forward to seeing what he does in that world. So I'm pleased to introduce the co-director, my new co-director, Dr. Dwana Duncombe-Hayden. She is a lecturer in the NIV first year program. She's a native of Montgomery, and there were a number of reasons she was a natural choice for this role as co-director. And some of the reasons include her knowledge of and connections to Montgomery and the history. She's also very organized and helpful in a variety of ways. I'm very excited to work with her as we finish up the third year of the grant. I'm going to ask her to introduce today's speaker.
Good morning. A Spanish-American philosopher, George Santayana, famously said, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." Our speaker's life mission is to assure that we never forget. Dr. Howard Robinson II is the Alabama State University's archivist, and he also teaches in the university's History and Political Science department. Dr. Robinson specializes in African American history and has written on the student protest movement of the 1960s. He consistently works closely with the National Center for the Study of Civil Rights and African American Culture. He has also taught at Armstrong Atlantic State University and has worked with the Ralph Mark Gilbert Civil Rights Museum, both located in Savannah, Georgia. He is also a proud member of Omega Psi Phi Fraternity Incorporated. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you our speaker, a graduate of Alabama State University, and now the Assistant Professor of History and the University Archivist, Dr. Howard O. Robinson II.
Okay. Good morning.
Good morning.
It's delightful to be here. Thank you, Dr. Stallings, thank you for this invitation. I'm excited to speak at this Civil Rights and Civic Virtue Society breakfast. It's Black History Month, and that's one of my favorite months of the year. But anyway, I wanted to talk, understanding your mission and your desire to talk about civic virtue. I think today's discussion around student activism speaks directly to that. In today's conversation, I want to look at student activism that played out here in Montgomery, particularly, but not exclusively, around Alabama State University, and how the tentacles of that episode on the 1965 voting rights campaign sort of reached throughout the nation and gave opportunities for students to participate in the movement in ways that I think resonates through their lives, and they talk about that in the subsequent conversation. But I sort of created an outline, and I wanted to, so I'm going to leave this podium for the duration of my conversation, because the PowerPoint sort of drives the conversation, and it's not a lot of writing, but the images sort of speak to the different episodes. But I'll start with all the organizations that are really critical. And although there are a number of organizations, there are two that are really critical to the movement of the voting rights campaign here in Montgomery. And we'll talk about those organizations initially. And then we'll talk about Selma and the Alabama Black Belt. Many times, and when you think about the voting rights campaign, you think about the Selma and Montgomery March, and you think about Selma and Dallas County and Montgomery. But this campaign was a region-wide campaign. And so that movement was festivized throughout the Alabama Black Belt, at least 7 or 8 counties, and they all were really critical in developing young activists who participated in these various counties, but also fed into the larger movement. And we'll look at some connections. You'll see that what's happening in different spaces around the state and around the nation are influenced. It's like a symbiotic relationship between these movements, and we'll look a little bit at that. And particularly how students are able to activate young activists throughout the nation in an era before social media. And then we'll look at some of the really critical episodes that occur here in Montgomery, particularly the Jackson Street Melee, and you'll understand what that is, hopefully after this conversation. And then I move on to the Selma and Montgomery March proper, the resulting Voting Rights Act, the 1965 Voting Rights Act, and then some of the ways that we reflect on this movement and celebrate it, but also are having to revisit some of the issues that were addressed in the mid-1960s. So, we're going to start with the Montgomery bus boycott. And it's a critical episode in the American Civil Rights Movement, which principally because it really sets the stage for the Civil Rights Movement. It's a template. So what you see in the bus boycott is through Martin Luther King and his adherence to nonviolent resistance. Let me just say something about that. The community was also, not only the Montgomery community, but the larger Black community in the United States was receptive to this idea of nonviolent resistance. You look at there's a newspaper published, Black newspaper published in Montgomery, Colored Alabama, and it talks about, in 1947, it's talking about Mahatma Gandhi and how what is happening, or the movement in India against imperialism is applicable to the United States. They say this movement, this nonviolent movement that Mahatma Gandhi is waging in India, can be applied to the African, they call the Negro movement in the United States. So there's there's discussion around that in the 1940s. And you see it in the newspapers, the black newspapers, both locally and nationally, okay? So when King comes to Montgomery and is advocating this idea of nonviolent resistance, it resonates. One of the things that happens also is he's attracting to Montgomery because of this move, the bus boycott. He's attracting those adherents to nonviolent resistance. And so, and to the degree, there's this gentleman, James Lawson, who goes to India, right, to study the Indian movement and reads about what's happening in Montgomery, Alabama. He says, the movement that I'm in India to study so that I could bring back to the United States is happening. And he had to leave India to catch up with what's happening here. And so these people, these adherents to pacifism and nonviolent resistance throughout the nation are descending on Montgomery because they see King is applying this idea to an actual situation, a challenging of segregated seating in Montgomery. And so you see how the creation of the Montgomery Improvement Association, and let me just put a plug in for Alabama State. We think about the Montgomery bus boycott, and we hear about Rosa Parks, she takes a seat, and she refuses to relinquish her seat. And then there's a bus boycott, right? How do we get from refusing to relinquish a seat to a bus boycott? And so how you get there is English professor Joanne Robinson. She's a member of what they call the Women's Political Council. It's an organization by this Congress by the 1950s, about 300 black women. They have about 3 groups in Montgomery. The core group of the anchor group is at Alabama State University. And these black middle class women are agitating against discrimination in public parks, police officers. So they advocate for black police officers and are able to convince or work through the political process to throw their support behind a local candidate who is advocating for the implementation or hiring of black police officers. They negotiate with a number of other organizations that they get black police officers. The Women's Political Council organizes black students in Montgomery to hold mock elections. So at a time where it's very difficult for black people to vote in Montgomery, these women are organizing black students at high schools and teaching them about civic participation and political participation and how a representative republic works. So they hold these mock elections. They actually go downtown to City Hall after they're elected and sit in City Hall and sort of conduct business. So it's a very interesting dynamic that these women are engaged in. They also are very interested in the bus situation. And so after several of the women who are leaders of the organization have episodes or experience episodes on the bus. Joanne Robinson, who becomes the president in 1950, is going out to fly out to Cleveland, Ohio. The bus driver stops the bus and draws back his fist and threatens her to move out of her seat and move to the back of the bus. And she's so shocked by this encounter, she bolts from the bus, calls a friend, and he takes her to the airport. But then she returns to Montgomery and she starts to survey the women in the Women's Political Council, and she finds out that most of them have had these types of episodes on the buses. And so when they hear about first the arrest of Aurelia Browder, then Mary Louise Smith, then Claudette Colvin, 16 years old, and they say, and they start to formulate this idea of a bus boycott. They make plans for a bus boycott. They start to agitate the black community about a bus boycott. And one of the male figures at the time, E.D. Nixon, is a labor organizer with the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. They put restraints on the women. No, it's not the right time. It's not the right people. And so during the course of 1955, all of these women are arrested during the course of 1955. And so Rosa Parks' arrest is the straw that breaks the camel's back. She's Edie Nixon's secretary in NAACP. And so then Edie Nixon acquiesces to the women and says, okay, when they come in and say, we're gonna boycott. They've already created the literature. She grabs several of her students. They go to Council Hall on Alabama State's campus. They run off flyers announcing this bus boycott. Edie Nixon makes a number of phone calls, and he calls this new minister in town, Reverend Martin Luther King, who tells him, Brother Nixon, let me think about this boycott idea. Let me think about this. And let's talk a little later. Edie Nixon makes another round of phone calls, gets back to Reverend King and says, Reverend King, are you with us? Are you going to participate in this meeting? And Reverend King says, yes, I'm going to participate, Brother Nixon. And then Nixon says, well, great, because we're going to have a meeting at your church. And they do. They meet at Reverend King's church. The women are meeting at the same time, right, in separate rooms. Right? Joanne Robinson is getting permission from the Women's Political Council to move forward in this bus boycott. The men are talking about this bus boycott. And then they form this organization, the Montgomery Improvement Association. And I mention that because the Montgomery Improvement Association grows, it then spawns because of its success, right? So that template I talked about, it's played out in the Montgomery Improvement Association with King's adherence to nonviolent resistance. It's a church-based movement, right? And the Montgomery Improvement Association has both lay, but a lot of ministerial leaders, because that's an easier way to organize a black community around these churches, right? And so this nonviolence, church-based, then they're gonna have these mass meetings. First, once a week, then bi-weekly, right? So there's mass involvement. Then over time, Attorney Fred Gray is going to advocate for litigation, right? And so after the city implements a get tough policy, the Montgomery Improvement, they arrest 89 folks and arrest and indict 89 folks, and they're really trying to put the hammer down on the bus boycotters. Attorney Gray is finally able to initiate a litigation. The bus boycott litigation, of course, escaped my mind. The Browder versus Gale case, and so the Browder versus Gale case then is the legal part of the movement, and it's really the Browder versus Gale case that ends the bus boycott, right? So it's litigation, nonviolent civil disobedience, it's mass mobilization, it's church-based organization. All of these factors or features are hammered out in the bus boycott. And then those people who are descending on Montgomery from around the nation and the world, because they see what King is doing and they see the implementation of this agenda that they already feel is the right approach. They help to shape King's thinking. When for instance, when Bayard Rustin or some of these other folks, pacifists, come to Montgomery and to see that King, although he's espousing nonviolence, has bodyguards with guns to protect him. And they said, no, Brother King, this is, if you are an advocate and an apostle of nonviolent resistance, you can't have this, right? It's inconsistent. And so they help King to sort of modify and sort of fine-tune, his ideas around nonviolent resistance, so that it's not for them a strategy or tactic. It's a personal philosophy and theology. Okay? And so they form as the Montgomery bus boycott is winding down. There's a series of court cases and they know they're going to win. They start to formulate ideas of exporting what happened in Montgomery with the successful Montgomery bus boycott, exporting that southwide, and they create the Southern Christian Leadership Conference to do that. It mirrors the Montgomery Improvement Association. Actually, from 1957 to 1960, King was both president of the Montgomery Improvement Association and president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, right? For his first 3 years, They're both housed here in Montgomery, right? Even though the offices are in Atlanta, but King is in Montgomery. And the activities surrounding the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and the Montgomery Improvement Association are really in the same place. Okay? So we have the creation of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference out of the Montgomery bus boycott, and then the desire to spread that movement Southwide. I wanted to mention this gentleman, Bob Zellner, because Bob Zellner is a student at Huntington, right, in the mid-1950s, and he hears about what's happening in terms of civil rights. He's also witness to the student sit-in movement, and so he has a professor at Huntington who is assigned him and some of his classmates a sociological report, and they decide to deal with race relations. And so Zellner and four of the students want to look at the Montgomery Improvement Association and its development. And so they want to go interview King and Reverend King and Ralph Abernathy, second in charge. And his professor said, no, you're going to interview the Klan and the White Citizens Council, right? Because you don't need, all the various sides of the story. That would be a better approach. Zellner and his classmates ignore the professor, and go and start attending the mass meetings, right? They interview King, interview Abernathy, interview Rosa Parks. He becomes sympathetic to what they're doing. Actually, they had signed a petition and raised money at Huntington to support the Montgomery Improvement Association. Send the letter, send the money. It creates a firestorm. The Huntington officials want to expel Zellner and his fellow students. Okay, he gets on the radar of the FBI. They create a file. His letter gains the attention of Ann Braden, who's another civil rights, white civil rights activist, who then puts Zellner in touch with this new organization. I'll talk about the organization. But you have, and this is not a unique phenomenon. And you see it in the literature, and you see it in the documents at Auburn University, University of Alabama. There's a small minority of white students who are sympathetic to the civil rights movement, a very small minority. There's a book out of Tennessee I just reviewed, and it talks about the movement in Tennessee, student movement in Tennessee. But the same thing is happening here, because you can see students at these schools writing in support of students at Alabama State, and actually visiting Montgomery to support the students at Alabama State. So it's not an isolated, the phenomenon is impacting students, and it's going to impact them in a much larger way as we move forward, particularly with the 1960 sit-ins. So in 1960, February 1st, students in North Carolina A&T sit in at Woolworth's lunch counter, and they spark a region-wide movement. In 1960 alone, there are 60,000 students who are going to participate in sit-ins across the South. And so, although there are sit-ins that happen beforehand, before the 1960s, this is the one that sort of crystallizes a new phase in the student movement. And so remember, we said that the Montgomery Improvement Association was created in 1955. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference was created in 1957, right? The Southern Christian Leadership Conference is wanting to do around the South what the Montgomery Improvement Association did in Montgomery. And but they're not as successful. And they would be given an enormous shot in the arm by the students. The students are going to really reinvigorate the campaign and sort of send it into sort of another more productive phase with their sit-in movement. Okay, so Alabama State students hear about the sit-ins and want to conduct their own sit-ins. And so the students at Alabama State are talking about this sit-in, and so Martin Luther King has left. It's 1960, Martin Luther King has just left Montgomery, and he's gone to Atlanta to head up the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Ralph Abernathy takes over the Montgomery Improvement Association. The students, now if you've ever been to Alabama State, on campus are two houses. One is the house that Nat King Cole was born in. It was moved from where the stadium is now, so a couple of blocks over. But it was moved to be next door to the Ralph David Abernathy house. That was the house that was the parsonage of First Baptist Church. And so Ralph Abernathy lived there in 1960. So the students walked across the street to Ralph Abernathy's house, and they talked to him about their desire to replicate what's happening in North Carolina A&T and started to spread throughout the Upper South. They would be the first students in the Deep South to hold a sit-in, right? And so they're sitting in the living room of Abernathy's house, talking to he and his wife, Abernathy's wife, and Abernathy's wife, well, Ralph Abernathy says, okay, you know, I think you should sit in at the county courthouse because Maxim Butler's the sheriff, and he's going to be a little more lenient than the city police, right? And the sheriff are responsible for the courthouse. Juanita Abernathy, his wife, asked the students, well, when are you going to sit in? And they say, well, we're going to raise some money, we're going to organize students. And so they start to talk to her about what they foresee as their plans. She says, oh, listen, since the bus boycott several years ago, they're bugging, and we believe they're bugging this house, right? So they listen to this conversation. The authorities are listening to this conversation. If you don't sit in tomorrow, you might as well forget about it. So this is the night of the 24th. The 25th, they sat in. 29 students went down, Alabama State students, walked down some road to the county courthouse and sat in at the lunch counter in the basement of the courthouse. One day, a couple of hours, they had sat in the cafe, and they turned off the lights. The solicitor turned off the lights, and the students go out into the hallway. This is a picture of the students in the hallway. That's Maxim Butler. He looks a bit imposing with the billy club, but he actually was pretty fair in 1960s law enforcement policy, perspective. So the students sit in one day, a couple hours, and then after they sat in and they sat in the hallway for a little while, then they went back to campus. As a whole upheaval, a Supreme Court case, another federal case, those 9 students on the left are expelled. 14 professors are dismissed. The president is fired eventually. So the sit-ins have a cataclysmic impact in Montgomery. So, but it does bring the students into close contact with and collaboration with the Montgomery Improvement Association through Reverend Ralph Abernathy. So you see these sit-ins, those 9 students that were expelled, students at Alabama State are protesting that expulsion, right? Protesting on campus. They actually, one of the episodes, the students are protesting at the center of campus. The police come, they arrest some students. It's a confrontation. The students march downtown and to the state capitol. They sing a variety of songs, hold speeches. There's a whole nother Supreme Court case that comes out of that. The New York, and anybody who's into First Amendment rights and libel and slander would know the Sullivan versus Times case. The New York Times versus Sullivan, depends on when it was appealed, what you call it. But the New York Times versus Sullivan case, in the New York Times, a group out of New York describes the student activists and what's happening in Montgomery, and there's inaccuracies in their description, in the advertisement that's taken out of the New York Times, and so the local L.B. Sullivan, who's a city commissioner, the city had 3 commissioners instead of a city council. New York, L.B. Sullivan sues the New York Times because of these inaccuracies. And the New York Times, in that New York Times, after the litigation, the state Supreme Court finds the defendants guilty, starts to take their property, it's appealed to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court says no. And it's a cornerstone First Amendment case where a public official, public figure, cannot just demonstrate that a report or a news article is incorrect or has inaccuracies. They have to prove that it was published with actual malice, with a reckless disregard for the truth, which is a much higher standard. So it frees up newspapers throughout the South to report on the civil rights movement. That all sort of stems from this sitting case at Alabama State. You have students in Nashville, Tennessee, and I wanted to highlight Diane Nash. She's there with the mayor. And this is a critical moment in the movement. That's why I wanted to go to Tennessee to look at this, because Diane Nash, who's the person, this young lady right here, is in a confrontation with the mayor, Ben West, and she asked the mayor in newspapers and television cameras, she says, do you think that the segregation of students, of black people, and the refusal to admit them to public accommodations, do you think that is right? And he said no. He didn't think it was right. And so she becomes, because of her dedication, she becomes a really major figure in the student movement, and we'll see her a little later on. So, this woman right here, Ella Baker, who works for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and it's interesting because she has a critique of the Southern Leadership Conference. She thinks it's heroic based, it's based around the personality of Martin Luther King. And she wants a more democratic, a more participatory organization. She runs into loggerheads with the more machismo, male-centered Southern Christian Leadership Conference, right? And so she advocates that these students who are spontaneously engaged in these sit-ins all throughout the South, including Alabama State students, she said we need to organize those students. She calls a meeting of those students at her alma mater, Shaw University, and they come together in a meeting and create the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, right? And so that's the second organization. It's created out of the sit-ins with the assistance of the adults in the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And so, this is a little flashing a little bit forward, but I want you to understand. The students are in contact with one another. They eventually create a newspaper, the Student Voice. They create a wide area telephone service so that eventually, as they have these student groups and student field workers all over the region, all over the Southeast, the South, and the South, and eventually Southwest, and throughout the nation, they have a telephone line that these students could call. So they're charged to the SNCC field office. But what happens is they create they have a for lack of a better term, a stenographer or a person who's taking notes at the other end of the line. So the students are calling in and discussing what's happening in their respective locales. And so we'll see some of those documents in this presentation. But it's the predecessor to our social media. This is how the students are communicating. They are really taking advantage of this communication network. And you'll see that a little as we go on. This is Bernard Lafayette. And these folks, when I started this, things sounds like it's history, but, I was born in '62, and some of you are older than me. But these folks are here, so it's interesting to be able to not only read about what they do, what they've done, but then to talk to them and interview them. But Bernard Lafayette is going to, as the SNCC makes a transition from a coordinating committee where they're coordinating and providing communication between student groups. They're starting to send or organize, sending out students to different locales to either initiate or participate in campaigns in different locales. Bernard Lafayette goes to, he first goes to Mississippi and cuts his teeth in Mississippi, but then he comes to Selma, and he organizes what becomes the Selma campaign, the Alabama campaign. And then he tries to organize adults, but like they found out in Mississippi, it's easier to organize young people. And so you're going to see a lot of young people. Matter of fact, the Selma campaign for the first 2 years between 62 and 63 was a student campaign. And when I say student campaign, I mean it really was a student campaign. This is Collier Lafayette, Bernard Lafayette's wife. He leaves the campaign in Selma, goes to Mississippi where he participated in the freedom rides. He's incarcerated. After he's let out, he participates in organizing students. He meets Collier Lafayette, and then they marry. She comes back to Selma. So both Collier Lafayette and Bernard Lafayette are organizing in Selma. Collier Lafayette is asked by Martin Luther King to leave Selma and to go to Birmingham to work with the Birmingham campaign, Operation Confrontation. The Birmingham campaign is interesting because it too becomes driven by students. And so the idea is to overwhelm the system, the system in Birmingham with students, and they do. Thousands of students in Birmingham participate in their campaign, but Collier Lafayette is there too. So she's forming a connection between the students in Selma and the students in Birmingham. And so I just wanted to just threw this picture in because I want you to see what happened. This is what, and this is the same thing that's happening in Selma. There are 3,000 students in 2 years that are locked up in Selma. And Sheriff Clark is making arrangements with 7 other jails in the region to house these students as they are packed into these jails. Of course, there's the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in 1963 in Birmingham. Collier Lafayette is there, right? And she's pregnant and has some difficulties with her pregnancy. Actually, she had been hit by a water hose in one of the demonstrations. And so Bernard Lafayette leaves Selma to see about his wife in Birmingham. Well, when he leaves Selma, this church is bombed. The students that he had been organizing and training in Selma want to go out and protest in reaction to what's happening in Birmingham. But their mentor, Bernard Lafayette, is not there. They go to a house. Typically, when you have a campaign, there's a house they call the Freedom House. They go to the Freedom House. They're looking for Bernard Lafayette, and he's not there. They call the SNCC office. They say, we're going to protest, but we need somebody from the SNCC office to come down and help us. At the SNCC office, they're trying to find somebody. They're not able to send anybody. The student said, okay, what has Bernard Lafayette trained us to do? He's always told us that I'm not your leader. You're your own leaders. This is your community. We are training you to effectuate change in your community. You are the leaders, right? And so these students understand that. He's trained them for several months. They've been doing voter registration, and so without SNCC supervision, they start a campaign in Selma. And so that's just 4 girls who were killed. Diane Nash, she marries James Bevel, and they come up with this idea in Birmingham. They're people who decide in Birmingham to use these young people. So when those 4 girls are killed, they take it personally. They have involved these young people in a campaign that has caused the life of these 4 girls. And so they decide, they sit down and try to brainstorm of how do they respond. and they come up with what they call the Alabama Project, where they're going to attack disenfranchisement to empower black adults with the vote, so that no longer could their children be killed with impunity. And so by this time, James Bevel has graduated from SNCC as a student, and he's moved to the SCLC. And so this idea is coming from really the SCLC. But you see that there's really a close correlation between the students in SNCC and the students and the adults in SCLC. But this is a student protest, and you can see what these students look like in the protest itself. It culminates with the death of Jimmy Lee Jackson in Marion, Alabama. It's a night protest. Jimmy Lee Jackson is there with his mother and his grandfather. The police start to attack, the state troopers start to attack the marchers in Marion, Alabama, and several of them escape to a cafe. They escape to a Max Cafe in Selma. The police, state troopers come in the cafe, start assaulting folks, and assault both Caja Lee, who's Jackson's grandfather. His mother responds. Jackson then responds to his mother being attacked by state troopers. The state troopers shoot Jimmy Lee Jackson point blank range. He struggles out of the cafe, falls to the floor, he's beaten. He's eventually taken to the hospital, and the police follow him to the hospital, charge him with three charges to him while he's in the bed of convalescing. He dies several days later, and the idea then is born to take the body of Jimmy Lee Jackson, march it up Highway 80, and place it at the steps of the state capitol. The idea for a Selma to Montgomery march emerges out of that protest of decision. The Selma to Montgomery march occurs. That's an interesting dynamic. So you have on March 7th is Bloody Sunday. This is an SCLC activity. Martin Luther King and the SCLC want to march to Montgomery. Now let me take a little time and sort of describe what the conflict is here. The SCLC wants voting rights legislation, right? They want to demonstrate to the federal government through these protests and activities a need for federal legislation. The students in SNCC felt like the 1957 Civil Rights Act, which had voting rights provisions, did not work. The 1960 Civil Rights Act, which had voting rights provisions, did not work. The 1964 Civil Rights Act, which had voting rights provisions, did not work. They had no confidence that a new voting rights piece of legislation would in fact work. So they opposed, they wanted to do grassroots organizing to, again, empower people in these local communities to take political and social control of their communities. Right? They wanted the federal government to protect the people as they attempted to vote based on existing law. So there's two different types of approaches. One by the young people who are more inclined for this grassroots organizing, and the adults and the SCLC who wanted to push through this legislation. So when you have the Selma to Montgomery March, actually the students vote, and the Student Nonviolence Coordinating Committee, they vote not to participate in the march. But they do allow members, young people, and members of the SNCC to participate as individuals. John Lewis is the chairman of SNCC, but he's also on the SCLC board. He participates as an individual. And of course, he's beaten on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Now there's a mantra or an idea in the movement at the time, particularly amongst the young people. And that idea is, that you don't allow violence to end a campaign. So they wouldn't allow violence to end the freedom rides. The students then reinforced Congress of Racial Equality. They took up the freedom rides when they were going to stop it in Birmingham. They said, no, we won't allow violence to end our movement. Once the marchers were attacked on Edmund Pettus Bridge, the students stepped in and took over and said, we're going to send students now in from all over. And we're going to pick up this mantle. We're going to ram this, literally, they said, we're going to ram this march down George Wallace's throat. Right? So the students have embraced this idea. I wanted to share this with you. The students, and now by 1965, the students are very sophisticated in their network. So with that wide area telephone service, they call in these watch lines, and they give an account of what's happening. And so this one says, at 4:06 p.m., 2 carloads of possemen just went to the bridge. The police are making local whites get indoors. SLC Fontroy is in Washington, D.C., talking to congressmen. A lot of churches in New York City, contacted earlier by SCLC, are calling in because they go down. SNCC's Annie Pearl Avery was just arrested. Don't know what for. She just passed by a police car. 2 local white guys were also arrested. 3 doctors, and so it's going through step by step what he sees, right? And it's interesting because there's another page to this, and he's describing what's happening. People are being beat. Then he says, oh, the police are coming towards me. And then the transmission stops. Right? And so there's thousands of these reports that are coming in from students all over the region, and they're transcribed in these field reports. And it gives you almost a day-by-day, play-by-play feel for what's happening in the movement. So King, after March 7th, Bloody Sunday, King calls clergymen to come to Selma and to participate in another march. At the same time, King is in consultation or conversation with the Johnson administration. At the same time, federal judge Fred Johnson places an injunction on marches. He says, no more marches can be had until I have a hearing and determine how to move forward, right? So, there's a tacit agreement between King and the Johnson administration that the marchers will march to Edmund Pettus Bridge, kneel down and pray, and then turn around and go back to the Brown's Chapel in Selma. The students don't know about this conversation and these negotiations. King does not want to violate the injunction. Why? Because he's most interested in having the 1965 Voting Rights Act passed. And by violating the injunction, he may lose congressional support. So the students are outraged, right? So King, the students call that turnaround Tuesday, when the marchers kneeled and turned around. SCLC calls it the Minister's March. It's just 2 different ways of looking at the same event, right? James Foreman, who's the executive director of SNCC, John Lewis is the chairman, James Foreman is the executive director. Foreman says, I want students to protest where you are, or travel to Washington, D.C., or come to Montgomery. At this point, SNCC has 400 auxiliary or student support groups around the nation, and they activate these groups. And so you have students all over the nation. New York, Los Angeles, Atlanta, in Guam, in Canada, all over the nation and parts of the world protesting because SNCC told them to, right? So then, from the White House vantage point, they see all of these protests crop up around the nation. They tell students to go to Washington, D.C. 15,000 students descend on Washington, D.C. and protest for 2 weeks in Lafayette Park across the street from the White House. President Johnson is complaining that the noise is keeping his daughter from doing her homework. And of course, the SNCC representatives are not sympathetic. But they have sit-ins inside the White House. Now, what the student SNCC is doing at this time, there are busloads of students coming to D.C. and they happen to go to the Washington Monument. They thought, where are you all from? Okay. We're from such and such. Okay. They give them paper, pens. We want you to write letters to your congressman, right? Because letters from a congressperson's constituents are more impactful than from letters from somewhere else around the nation. Then they have, okay, I'm going to show at some other point in this presentation. I should have put it there, but there's an application. So one of the more sophisticated things that students are doing is that you see all these students protesting. They filled out applications. SNCC had the students fill out applications, listing phone numbers, mother and father's name, all this stuff, where they're from, and then they're calling their parents. And they say, your son, your daughter is in Mississippi, is in D.C., is in Alabama protesting. You want your child protected, you need to call your congressman and tell them to make sure that there's protection for your child and to pass the voter rights legislation. And so, this letter writing campaign, all of these students that are protesting, they're engaging them in letter writing campaigns. Then they're saying, okay, if you're going to protest in different cities, we want you to go to the post office, federal installation. We want you to go to a congressional office. We want you to go to a federal courthouse. We want you to protest on federal installations. Okay. Students from Tuskegee, 800 students are going to mobilize in Tuskegee and travel to Montgomery to participate in the campaign. Lynn Patton, George Ware are some of the students who organized that. Students from Alabama State, these are 3 of the student leaders from Alabama State who are going to organize, Willie Ricks from SNCC is going to go to the Alabama State campus and going to organize among students for them to participate in the campaign as it descends on Montgomery. And then you have it's called the Great Peon. I'll explain. Right? Does the Great Peon need explanation? With that, when the federal, when Judge Johnson, Frank Johnson, handed down that ruling, that injunction, he said there's no protest until I rule on whether you can move forward with the Selma Montgomery March. King called a halt to all the protests. They were supposed to meet students in Montgomery. March first from Marion, then they decided on Selma, march up Highway 80, and meet in Montgomery. The students decide, despite King's canceling the Montgomery campaign, they're going to come to Montgomery anyway. So the students come to Montgomery. These are students, mostly those are students from Tuskegee, who have a petition they want to hand to the governor. Now, had the governor just accepted the petition, nothing would have happened. But he didn't accept the petition, so which gives them a rallying point. The students arrived about 11 o'clock at First Baptist Church on Ripley Street, Black First Baptist Church. Then they marched down to the state capitol, and they give word to the governor that they want to deliver this petition. The governor refuses to come out. They're going to stand in the street until they come out. And you notice the state troopers are not letting the students on any state property. Actually, the city police are pushing the students off city property, off the streets, saying you have to get on the sidewalk. So they're arresting students for being in the street, but the state troopers are keeping them from getting onto the sidewalk, right? It's sort of an untenable situation. The students decide just to sit down in the middle of Dexter Avenue in front of the Capitol. And so the city police in Montgomery have taken a policy, a position of nonviolence. They said, we're gonna wait the students out. And so there's a contest of attrition. And so about 5 or 6 o'clock, your bodily functions start to kick in, right? The police have surrounded the students. If you leave, you can't come back. They're not letting anybody in. They're not letting food in. If you leave to go to the bathroom, you can't come back. So the New York Times says that the students got up and urinated in unison. The participants said, no, they had these protest cards. They placed some protest cards around people as they urinated. Whatever happened, they urinated. You know, now some people describe a stream of urine rolling down Goat Hill. The FCLC is livid because they see this as an embarrassment. Right? So there's some, again, that tension between the older folks. How much time do I have?
We're getting really close.
Okay, I'm almost finished. Okay, so the students, about 1 o'clock in the morning, it starts to rain. That's what disperses the students. They go and seek refuge in the different churches around. Okay. These are the students coming into Montgomery. So you had students protesting the state capitol, students protesting the different parts of the nation, and you had students from colleges from all over the nation coming. That's Booker T. Washington High School. This is Jackson Street Baptist Church. This is one of those, this is an application from Mississippi. But you see here that that they're asking, you know, who's your representative's name? Who's your senator's name? Your 2 senators. Your parents' name, your father's name, your mother's name. So this is the application. So these students, they know who's protesting. They have their applications. Okay. These are students marching Alabama State Church. This is the Jackson Street melee. The posse. This posse that attacked the students on Jackson Street. You can see some of their horses here. The students the posse is from Selma. Sheriff Clark's posse, he takes them to Tuscaloosa, he takes them to Mississippi, he takes them to Birmingham, he brings them to Montgomery, right? This is how posse will travel. And so they attack, initially they started attacking labor organizers, but then they moved to the civil rights movement. This person right here is James Foreman. He's remember the executive director of SNCC. This is James Bevel, who came up with the Alabama Project. They're actually debating. They're debating the SCLC approach versus the student approach. And these are students listening to them. James Foreman speaking. That's Martin Luther King, Abernathy, Jesse Douglas, the president of the Montgomery Improvement Association, James Foreman, SNCC, Ralph Abernathy, SCLC. And you see they're arresting students from all over the nation. This is on Jackson Street. This is the entrance of Alabama State University's campus. And you see the magnitude of students who are in town protesting. Some other pictures. This is a very popular picture. People often confused with the Selma Montgomery March. This is on Jackson Street. That's the Benoit Hotel. You can go there today and see the same scene. Of course, there's Ralph Abernathy, James Foreman again, King, Jesse Douglas, the MIA president, John Lewis. The same picture, but you see a little, that's Dorothy Frazier. She's one of those students that we identified. That's Timothy Mays, another Alabama State student. Dorothy Frazier, when she protested, her father accompanied her. That's her father behind her. He had a gun. She brought the gun to campus a couple of years ago to show us. Her father would accompany her to these protests, but he would follow around with his gun, right? Because he was going to protect his daughter. So she was nonviolent of sorts. And you can see the kids, they marched to the county courthouse on the 17th after the Jackson Street melee, and the students, the adults, King, federal authorities, county and state officials, city officials negotiated into the violence. And King comes out and announced that they had come to an agreement. City representatives apologized for the violence inflicted upon the students, and they announced that the Johnson administration, that Frank Johnson, Judge Johnson, has lifted an injunction and prepared the way for the Selma Montgomery March to continue. But the students continue at City Hall to protest. And then, of course, the culminating march from Selma to Montgomery. This is an advertisement by the Montgomery MIA and SLC to get students to participate. I want to say this now. All of the marches were majority students. The march from the first march, Blood Sunday, was majority students from Selma and surrounding counties. In the Selma to Montgomery march, from Selma to Montgomery, Judge Johnson said there'd only be 300 people who could march through Lowndes County. You could have as many marches in Dallas County. It's a 2-lane highway at that time through Lowndes County. You could only have 300 marches. Then you could have as many marches in Montgomery County. So 300 people got to march the whole way. The SCLC chose 50 of those, and SNCC chose 250. Right? So the vast majority of the people who marched the entire Selma to Montgomery march were students. And you know them because at the end of the march, they were given orange jackets. These orange vests are the people who marched the whole entire way. That's how you distinguish them. This is Reverend Boone. He graduated from Alabama State. He's the front man for the SCLC. He goes up and heads up before the march, and he starts to prepare the way for the march. He comes to Alabama State, organizes about 800 students who march across town to meet the marchers coming into Montgomery. Okay, I'm going to end it there. I'm going to say this. These are just march scenes. And so, but it culminates, and what is effective is that President Lyndon Baines Johnson had passed the 1964 Public Accommodations Act, Civil Rights Act. He wanted to turn his attention to the Great Society, and he started passing Great Society legislation. He told King that he planned to pass voting rights legislation, but he wanted to get his seminal Great Society legislation through Congress. But if King wanted the Congress and the President to move on voting rights, he had to create a demand. Right? Told him that in a conversation on January 15th. And so the students are as much a part of creating that demand as anything, and anybody, and any organization. And so Johnson does reshuffle his legislative agenda and pushes the Voting Rights Act to the front of his agenda because of the protest. Now, the final trigger is, of course, the Bloody Sunday. You know, that's the final trigger. But it's all of these protests happening all over the nation, those are students. The protests that are happening outside the White House, that's the students. The protests that are happening in Montgomery, that's the students. It's a student protest. So one of the things that we did is when the National Park Service, under the administration of William Clinton, created the 54-mile Selma to Montgomery Historic Trail, they have 3 interpretive centers, one in Selma, one in Lowndes County, and one in Montgomery. We argued that in Montgomery, the students were at the center of the movement, and we argued that this interpretive center should go on the campus of Alabama State. After about 15 years, they agreed with us and built the center at Alabama State University. And so the research that you saw today was, in essence, what I accumulated to convince the National Park Service to locate the interpretive center at Alabama State. So with the dean of the library, Dr. Dana Franklin, and another professor, Dr. Dorothy Autry, We were able to convince the administration, the National Park Service, to establish this interpretive center, and we informed the exhibits. If you see the exhibits in the interpretive center, you would know exactly what the story is because you saw it today. And what I'm not going to deal with, but there's, I have to deal with this had happened in 2012. That's the same Reverend Boone that I said organized students and had to march from Alabama State to meet the marchers coming in from Selma. There was an effort to do an anniversary, and every 5 years they do a big anniversary march from Selma. And they wanted to have a really big one because there was a variety of issues of immigration, labor in that year. And so they wanted to organize students at Alabama State University. I was one of those naysayers, these students aren't gonna organize, these students aren't coming out, you know, and I was really pessimistic. But I saw there was a machine on campus, and they started having these conversations with students and organizing, and 1,000 students showed up to march and meet those marchers. I was stunned. And so, and then in the subsequent protests, I used to envy the 60s, right? Wow, that was a great time to live. You know, it's in the episodes that we've experienced over the last several years, the advent of, with a pandemic, the Black Lives Matter campaign, the election of what's the president's name? Him. You know, this is an interesting time to live in. And these students have responded to those issues that they think are impact their lives. And so I don't think that the spirit of activism and engagement is dead. I think that we have new tools today and new battles. But I have confidence that we have a generation of folks who are willing to meet those challenges. I don't know if we have time for questions.
I'm sure Dr. Robinson will be around if you have questions, and I have just a couple of requests for you. If you didn't sign in at that table outside, please do. As part of a grant, we report on how many people come to things, and also there's a QR code on your agenda where you will give us some feedback. Again, something we report to the funding agency, and I hope you'll join us for our future speakers and activities this semester. We will be going to, he mentioned the Judge Frank Johnson Institute. We'll go to EJI, which we usually do at Rosa Parks. If you feel free to leave if you need to, but if you have a question or two, I think he could take them. Anyone have a question?
I was really informative, wasn't I?
Yeah, you're a wonderful teacher. Well, I'll ask one question and
Sure.
then we'll close. You know, if you'd asked me before you started talking, I would have said that the reason that the movement was nonviolent was because of Martin Luther King, but I hear you saying it was much broader. Was it churches that influenced that, or can you explain? It seemed like it was coming from multiple areas.
It was coming from multiple areas, I believe. What King said and the position he took resonated. You had two different types of nonviolent behaviors. You had those like King who were going to adopt it as a personal philosophy and theology. And so, I got a chance to work with Reverend Boone, for instance, for years. He helped us, and he was a consultant with the National Center at Alabama State, he helped us with the establishment of the Interpretive Center. He was an example of someone who internalized nonviolence as a way of life. That's how he then approached the world in conflict. And you see that even with Bernard Lafayette, he's active today. He does nonviolent training. And so then you had folks like Stokely Carmichael, who realized the immense power of the system. the city governments, county, state, federal, and that it would be, they felt crucial to challenge in a way that would elicit violence, challenge white supremacy and racism and discrimination. And so they adopted nonviolence as a tactic, and they were not theoretically wedded to and changed tactics. You know, Stokely Carmichael, as part of there was always a tension between violence and nonviolence, or self-defense and nonviolence. And it's interesting because actually, and I didn't get into it, but actually, this episode in 1965 is like the demarcation. James Foreman, for instance, is going, and I saw a picture of him if you look at the church. He's talking. And he says that this is it. This is my last non-violent protest. I'm done. I've been arrested 20-something times, beaten, jailed. I'm done, right? And you see a transition in the movement to become more self-defense oriented, reactionary, deacons of defense, the Black Panther Party, you know. So there's these two streams that I think that one is certainly wedded to the idea of nonviolence as a way of life, and the other saw it as an effective tool.
Thank you so much. Let's give him another round of applause.